Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Happiness Index podcast. My name is Stefan Tornquist. I'm the managing director of executive summary research, and I'm here because I'm the lead author of the Global Workplace Happiness Report. So, for the next couple of months, I'm going to be borrowing the host chair from Matt Phelan and interviewing some of the experts and academics who have contributed to this report. And that's why we're here today. Uh, my guest today is Fiona McDonald. She is a global executive at organizations like Amazon and Booking.com. But as you'll discover in our conversation, she's had a long-term interest in how engagement data, how the signals from the organization don't just speak to our products and our efficiencies and our external efficiencies, but also to people and how that affects performance. She's also an author, and we'll hear later about the book she's working on. But I thought we could start by you telling us a little bit about your first book, which is called Two Mirrors and a Cheetah. I purposely didn't dig in because I wanted to discover where that name came from.
Yeah, well, thank you first of all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. When you spend 3 decades, which is what I've done in business and consumer and online marketplaces, you see a lot of stuff and you want to not just grow businesses, but you grow people as well. And so it was about 5 years ago when I started actually putting some of the thought sessions I'd given to people and developed inside some of the large companies I was working at. I put it into stories, and then those stories very coincidentally became a book during the pandemic, I think, like others. And it's called Two Mirrors and a Cheetah: Think Differently, Own Your Career, and Succeed by Being Yourself. And it was supposed to, and still is, and as I've been told it is received this way, a storytelling, very light read of a career book that uses some of my own personal examples that I draw along the way, just to make it more easy rather than sort of busy textbook stuff for people to be themselves and bring themselves to work.
So it's not one of those business books that we buy with the best of intentions, maybe read the introduction, and then just sits on a shelf because it's a bit dense and really should have been an email anyway.
I would hope not. It's a beach read was my mood board I had, and somebody, when I very first launched it, actually sent me a picture of themselves reading it on a beach. So that's the type of book it was.
Fantastic. Well, that's really what we all want. Um, so you're here because you wrote an essay about the deployment, for lack of a better word, of freedom at the organization. Um, and so it becomes an introduction to the section of the report that discusses freedom and looks at the benchmarks around that. Now, you start by contrasting all of the signals the growing number of signals that we have in the industrial and digital world, and how we put those to work optimizing products and processes. But we haven't done the same with our people.
Yes. Well,
You want,
where I kind of came at this topic from, that was the immediate thing that springs to mind. And I'm a visual person that sees what is a parallel to land something that's maybe difficult, easier for those who aren't familiar with the subject. And what I should also say, as well as being in business for many years, in recent years, and particularly starting at Amazon, I was an executive for diversity. So I had the next to the J job role of, seeing how you can increase representation. And so I was very closely involved with the Infinity groups and looking at how can you drive the environments that are more inclusive and make people feel comfortable being at work. And it was there that I started not just using engagement data, but looking at how would you do that as a business? If you're going to make everybody accountable for stuff, could you put some data points on the things you want to do, but they look less tangible? And then you start to see, actually, when you draw parallels to what you're trying to achieve that has nothing concrete around it, that we're doing this stuff in some areas for machines particularly brilliantly, and yet we don't transfer that logic over to what we call our core assets. And we have done for years, talked about people being our greatest asset. And there are some simple parallels, just to see, not to measure people, but look, what is the environment? How are things working? Are our messages getting through? Are people happy? All those types of things. And so it's an easy parallel to make because of the businesses I was in, first of all, it was largely manufacturing. And we went from being reasonably okay at working together to the world of Six Sigma, where you've got real sophistication in data, where you can, change production lines or have people bringing ideas to production line, just in time stuff, Kaizens, etc. And it really works when you can measure something, make people accountable and measure change and then know where to push and what to change. And it feels illogical not to be able to do that in the realm of environments at work and how people are feeling and therefore how people are able to thrive. At least that was my take on it.
Hmm. And in your experience at organizations that perhaps did some of that, the quantifying the unquantifiable, um, diversity is at such an interesting moment, where I feel like at least here in the States, I'll just speak
Yeah.
for whatever the heck is happening here. Uh, the 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 narrative around diversity has lost touch with the one of the key points, which is, um, you're not just doing this to be, a better member of the community. You're doing this because when you get a bunch of people with the same background, same education, they're going to go off the same cliff, or not see an opportunity, et cetera, or not connect to an audience. All of those
Yeah.
things. We've all got our cultural and historical blinders on. Uh, what kinds of Were you able to see in any sort of quantifiable way that, yes, actually, when you when you make the effort to bring in diverse points of view, it really does do all of those things that we hope it does?
Yeah, and first of all, there's a misconception that diversity equals diverse points of views, and you can have, if you take the sort of situation of people represented around a table, you can have a completely diverse set of people around a table, but unless they have the right conditions to bring their diverse contributions equally, you don't get that vibrant conversation that benefits from the multiple inputs. Now, to answer your question, have I seen it in the debates that people are willing to have, particularly at my time at Amazon, where actually it's a recent one I can draw from, encouraging everybody to be able to debate. If you have something to say, you can bring it to the table, and you get people from, different parts of the organization able to challenge or bring a point in that causes people to either go, no, we've thought of it, or actually, yeah, let's have a look at that. But of course, the environments need to have psychological safety. People need to be able to have, you know, listen to each other. You need to be willing to accept all points of view as valid. But of course, there's a discipline there in keeping to the facts and using the data rather than bringing in wild opinions that might have bias, that may have all those other things that are not necessarily helpful. But so I've seen it there really a lot. But even before I was at Amazon and organizations, that maybe I should clarify what I mean by engagement data and using it. But since the beginning of my working time of whatever 30 odd years, there has been the employee survey. Once a year, you ask people how they're doing. Is it a great place to work? How's your manager? Do you like working with your team? Whichever dimension an organization is chosen. And that is a set of data. And from year to year, you can see whether it's the same level or what's changed. And again, engagement data to me is just more of that on different frequencies and taken to next levels where you can say, okay, what was the point of having the answer to that data point year on year if you're not going to look for the trend and either take steps to remediate something or fixing or actually improve something you're proud of? And so that's what it really boils down to. If you do it once a year and say, hey, we're doing great because people like working here, well, why don't you have it in a manager on a weekly basis, in a team, et cetera, et cetera? And you can see how it can become powerful as long as you don't feel you're measuring people. You're simply using data points to help you to tell a story and to have better inputs and conversations. Does
Mhm.
that make sense?
It does. It absolutely does. And we'll probably come back to bits of that. Um, Early in your essay, you mentioned that stress, anxiety, burnout are all on the rise. So my first question is, I mean, that feels right, I think, to almost anyone reading it, but we all suffer from a recency bias. Were you able, whether in the Amazon annual or some other place, to that see something that reinforces or makes that point real?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the benefit of working for over 30 years means it's not all recent that I'm thinking of, and that's why I kind of look at that span over time. The trends, as having been a manager of various large teams, of absenteeism. You can see that one sort of hard coded, and it's not something we necessarily report, but you can see, without going into the details of how and why people are off sick, you've got your short-term sickness and you have your long-term sickness sort of baseline numbers, which you're dealing with there. But you also have these sort of survey points. But you have, um, burnout was something that was never talked about, and I don't think it ever really surfaced, although at the beginning of my career. But probably everybody amongst us now knows somebody who's maybe got this or talking about it or close to it. So either we're all talking about it more or it just is happening more frequently. And if I think of things like anxieties, a lot of the anxiety can, in some cases, be, let's say, driven by the pressure to be a certain way, and we all have mobile phones. They weren't there 30 years ago, right? So that is a fact that some of the things we're using, be it the social media or the way we connect, the way we interact, or indeed the way we work, with remote working having changed, etc. They have physically changed over time, and they bring different stresses and strains with them, as well as some of the advantages. And that's where you can really see, okay, we've moved in terms of how we work, but we haven't necessarily made sure we've caught up with the environment for people around that. And I think particularly in terms of the remote working, did we equip managers to teach people how to work best on Zoom full time with the same ability to read a room? Maybe not. Did we teach people to make sure that they need all those social relations, as well as good sleep and everything else, if they're going to work remotely on their own all the time? Potentially not. And so you can decode it into what's changed rather than just believe it's a recency thing post-pandemic, in my view.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, the pandemic will, and it's still too recent to have learned everything that there is to learn by a mile. But it was this fascinating, like, large scale social experiment, even in the world of work. And, I knew so many people that clearly found it amazingly in restful's not the right word, invigorating, but suddenly they had, I mean, I've worked remotely for almost 25 years. So it's just sort of baked into my life. But suddenly, the vast majority, at least of knowledge workers, found themselves in circumstances where, they could kind of tailor their day to how they personally prefer to work to a degree. And they could pull themselves out of a work day and go do something else if, circumstances allowed, in a way that I think a lot of people found enervating. Um, and so, you've got direction in that, sort of in the positive, but then at the same time, you've got companies trying to figure out how to move forward. And now it's, this kind of tumble of like, well, does everybody need to be back in the office? So that might not be quite right. Versus hybrid versus in the field. Um, and then you've got the X factor of electronic communications where, you're in many places expected to be, there all the time, um, no matter what time it is.
That is
Uh,
another thing in terms of what have you seen over the years. I hasten to say, there was no email when the beginning of my career. It was a desktop that was in the office I shared with three other people. And so, you'd get a couple of emails per week. The sheer volume of stuff which we deal with, and the fact that people are expected to, I don't subscribe to this, but people are expected to be on all the time and over the weekend. We've slipped into very bad digital habits. And I don't think our digital or, communicative hygiene is where it could be. Now, that physically wasn't there in early years. And I have to say, I'm not sold on remote working being the better of the two options. And I think it does depend on who you are, because I feel like some days I'm in my own pandemic still, because I may be working remotely and not seeing people. And I thrive on the energy of others and need, we're humans, we are naturally driven to be connected. And so having none of that permanently is never going to be another, uh, permanent or a decent extreme, but we've
mhm.
yet to really test out what those balances are. But definitely some of those things you mentioned, the devices where we communicate, and just the way we let everything, uh, we talked at the beginning of the conversation, distract us continually. That is driving stresses that we don't even maybe think of or keep top of mind. It's a different type of world we're working in.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, all right. So, oh, and by the way, so I'm looking at the data that's coming in from the happiness index study, and kind of uniformly across age ranges and seniority. Um, and this isn't just looking at preference for work style. This is
Mhm.
saying, okay, what is your work style, and then what are your various scores in, both emotional and on the happiness side, and more sort of rational brain on the engagement side. Hybrid work just outscores everything, but that's hybrid. And of course, everybody's definition of hybrid a little bit different, but I think, yeah, for most of us, some combination that gives us the opportunity to work deeply, perhaps at home or at least out of the office versus collaborate in office. If we can find that balance, it scores really well. Um, so you differentiate in the essay between the kinds of incentives that work in the short term, necessity is the mother of
Yeah.
invention and all that, versus building for sustained performance. And I think you use the expression preventative maintenance for people. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm an engineer, right? I might be a commercial person now, but I started off in the more technical side of stuff. And I even remember my first project was at British Aerospace, even coming out of school, and I worked on helping them, keep the assets of aeroplanes the way they are. And so I learned the idea of preventative maintenance is investing in something to keep its value as close to as, or maybe sometimes more than it already is. And then in the world of manufacturing, you want to fix something before a line breaks down, because when it is downtime, it costs you money, you don't make product, and it causes all sorts of, ramifications in your supply chain. And therefore, it is a practice of investing in stopping things happen and understanding causes, and really learning about failure modes to predict and remove. And I guess the same thing happens in cybersecurity, etc., that I've seen in recent years. So it's a well-trodden path of how to value assets, improve them, learn, and prevent collapses. And yet, if I think of the way we talk about the extremes of poor engagement, the anxiety, the burnouts, those are personal or human collapses. So, what would it take for us to see those coming and avoid them? And that feels, as a leader, the least I can be doing, because I grow businesses, I grow people. And it should be, and I hope people subscribe to the same thing. When you're working with people, you want the best for them. And nobody wants to manage their people into the ground. At least I hope it happens accidentally rather than people trying to run them into the ground in today's day and age. And so how do you know you're not running them into the ground unless you're seeing how they are? Because people can put on a front, they can act, they can turn up day in, day out, but their soul may be somewhere else because they've just had enough. And being able to, first of all, understand when people have reached limits that are not okay, but making sure you build environments that people don't go there. And to do that, you have to understand what pushes people, or certain people, and what people thrive on, and actually understand the in-between cases in the same way as a production line has the stuff where it's firing with the best, productivity and units per minute at a perfect cost, versus it's going to break down and it'll cost you a fortune to repair it, and it'll be out of order for a number of months. And so that's where my mind was coming out with that idea. And I believe that engagement data, or conversations at the end of the day, they help you have conversations where you can begin to understand what that is for different people. And where I've seen it in recent years, I guess I've been exposed a little bit more to startup modes in the 10 years that I've been in the tech space versus when I was in manufacturing businesses. And this idea of, being scrappy is great, but quite often, people put in everything. If you think bootstrapping is in those early years of a business where you literally probably do 7 days a week and everybody's throwing everything into it, but there's an energy and there's a passion for something, but it's not a 20, 30-year thing over time. It is a sustained high pressure moment, but it's not something you keep going on forever. You move into a different pace as an organization grows. But in those tech environments, I have seen more teams, not necessarily full organizations, existing in that high pressure mode far longer, because they've got used to that being the way the work culture is, rather than that was appropriate when you were scaling from nothing to being, up that first initial super exciting, high investment growth curve. And not being able to change out of that into a more sustainable race is like running a sprint when actually you're in a marathon. in that sort of analogy.
You were frozen there for a second, but I think hopefully our backup will have caught up. Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I've gone through the startup into larger, growing into larger organization, and it's very tricky. You stay in that mode in part because you don't know anything else. If it's a young team, new product, new company, these are people who get pretty good at being that 30-person team, 50-person team running at this, grand goal. And then when it becomes a 150-person team, a lot of the tools just aren't, there's no institutional memory, that applies.
Oh, but you mentioned incentives, and having worked in tech and not in tech, I've seen different incentive structures, and making people think like owners and having equity as a considerate piece of the compensation, regardless of what level are you in the organization. It tends to be for more senior levels or at least I experienced that prior to being in tech, whereas it's a common piece of remuneration in the tech world. You are then bought into and, behaving like it's your company and throwing things in a different way, but you also start to see big bonuses and big rewards, and you can see how easily they are chased versus actually the sabbatical or the non-financial things, because it's a carrot that is very attractive for many people. I've absolutely felt it myself. So that's what I call short-term things. For a year or two, when there's some big milestones to be hit, you can motivate even the least incentivized employee with something that is a big financial ticket, but that will never be enough to keep them firing on fully charged batteries with their mind in the game over time, because it just won't.
Absolutely not. So you talk about at one point that state where a team is really working at its best. It's
Yeah.
genuinely collaborating, not because there's a memo to work across silos or anything. Um, it's a great feeling. It's a productive state. It's rare. Um, how does what? Let's get to freedom. So, how does freedom play a role in sort of achieving or maintaining that flow state?
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think about this one quite a lot because it's not an obvious link for, being yourself suddenly leads to wonderful company returns. Everybody would do if it was super, super easy. But if I think when I've been in that flow state myself, when I've, loved what I'm doing and I've either been part of the environment or I've had my sort of teams working like that, it is truly wonderful and unique. So you do pause to think, how could I replicate that elsewhere? And I think the thing about being the freedom angle of you're free to be yourself at work. Now, when somebody's being themselves, they don't fear that they're not being valued. They don't fear that their contributions are not valid and that the way they're doing it is, received well by others. And it's a give and take. It's not just a me. Being yourself at work is regardless of the consequencing for others. When it's done well, people are able to be themselves without it being detrimental to others. And I think that's a bit of an important descriptor there. But often the teams where I've felt that sort of real buzz, people don't just know they're valued. They know that they're valued because they also know where and how they fit in, and they know where and how their contributions fit in. And you can achieve that as a leader by painting a picture people can get their heads around and buy into the direction that you're going when you're doing anything, and helping people see where various different bits of the business contribute, because then people know, even if they're maybe just stamping things, or that's a very derogatory sort of term for stuff. But when they know where their work contributes, it gives a different meaning to the value of what they do, when in isolation it may mean nothing. And I remember years and years ago, I was I was working on a project at Thornton's, and we actually met the group of ladies putting the coffee bean on the top of the chocolates, and they were handmade chocolates. I don't know if they still are today, and this is obviously quite a long time ago. But when you've worked in the stores and actually seen how these sort of hand-packed chocolates are chosen out by customers and how they talk about what they're getting, there is a super value of having that coffee bean on the top because it just sets something off. And it is a manual, or was a very manual thing. And these ladies were, quite happy doing it because it was something that mattered. But they needed to know that it mattered. They needed to understand how customers think of stuff. And you can do the same thing with many different workflows and many things that people do that may on their own look trivial, when you can connect everybody and what they do together to the big picture and why it matters for customers, particularly. You give people a sense of self and a sense of worth in what they're doing. And I think that's the thing that then gives people the ability to drop their barriers and actually have a moment of being able to come more as themselves. At least I've experienced it like that.
Mhm. And you talk about the reverse, which is that sort of self-protection mode that
Mm.
you get into uh, when you don't have the conditions for success. Um, I mean, how like is it very obvious when a team has slipped into self-protection mode?
I've lost you there.
I I was asking, is it very obvious when a team has slipped into that self-protective mode or an individual?
Yeah. So if you, well, the examples that come to mind when I think, if we talked about people around the table and bringing, diverse contributions, if, for example, somebody's going to be getting an idea out, but maybe they're not as speedy or eloquent as the person next to them. And in multicultural organizations, not everybody speaks the same language, nor at the same pace, nor their own mother tongues. If they're closed down too quickly, or if people don't invite contributions from everybody in, those individuals learn to just not bother. If somebody's going to take your idea and ridicule it as well, you're going to learn not to do that. And therefore, you start to hold back things. And soon people may not sit at the table, they may just sit in the corner because they believe that they won't be listened to anyway. And so it's not a stark black and white, but that gradual checking out of people if they aren't respected and actually appreciated. I have seen happen. I mean, they weren't always in my teams. I've certainly been in some of them. I've had the odd moment where I can see where it might have gone, but the hand that says stop, and if you don't, when you're guarding or having a conversation, if you don't make sure that you explain why certain things need to be paused, or when you'll come back to somebody's input, but just not at this moment, you can inadvertently also create those conditions. So it's for leaders to continually look for it and create the conditions and understand what each individual takes to bring out their best, I think.
Let's talk about those leaders and managers because I think it it is not in everyone's training or DNA to even think about it necessarily. You know, it um, like
Yeah,
the biggest step isn't from 0 to 1, but from nothing to 0.
I've lost you
That like,
again.
oh, engagement's a critical success factor for my team. Um, so if you go back to like the inputs into the industrial system,
Yeah.
what um, how do the real question is how do managers use engagement data in a practical way? But I think the preceding question might be how do you get managers to pay attention?
Yeah. So when I think about when did I start using it, because I've always been surrounded by this stuff, but if I take myself as an example as a manager, way back when I first started managing people, I think I got one or two people to try managing on. And I think that's how many of us come into management accidentally, and then you either get good at it or you don't. And self-awareness is not something that we tend to go into. I think the average is something like mid-40s. I was seeing recently. I was about 40 when I really started to pay attention to and value self-awareness and what that meant for me as a leader. And I had various moments where, with feedback or different, questionnaires myself, that I'd found out the way thought I was going to be perceived, or what I was trying to do, was different to how my leadership team perceived it, or how others perceived my different interactions. And so, using this was, I guess, sort of personality questionnaires, etc. You then think, oh, I've got something I need to change or improve as a leader. And then the question, how will I know when I fixed it, is something which you can answer when you have, different pieces of engagement data. So first answer, to your question is that depending on which type of questions you have built in your engagement data, you can help managers get better at managing. First of all, understanding how they're perceived and the effect they're having on people. And that's a huge one, given how many people leave their job because of the manager relationship, not the job. And we don't train for this stuff, but then looking at how your team is working together to help people see how they and their impact is being perceived by the team. And this is where, again, I'm thinking of questions I've had in the past where, do people feel they bring their honesty to the team? Is the team dysfunctional? Is the team able to work together? Or, does your manager trust you? Do you feel valued? Can you have the right conversations? All those things have been engagement data, which I've been exposed to over many different sorts of years. And when you can see it either over a period of time or versus other managers, which I found hugely useful,
Hmm.
particularly at Amazon, which is a company that's great at data, but it's also real time, and it has it at, I found I had it far more frequently than in maybe in other companies. So you can benchmark yourself over against others, not to be competitive, but if you see somebody who doesn't have the challenge you do, you can go and ask them how they're doing it. How is
Hmm.
it that you can have such a high score with your team? What can I learn from you? What am I missing that would make my leadership better? And equally, when you have data that's about how your team perceive you or what they're missing from you, or from each other, you have perfect neutral territory to keep discussions impersonal, which is important, to be able to discuss it as a team. Now, often teams don't discuss stuff because it gets personal too quickly, or people are uncomfortable and they don't know quite how to bring those conversations to the table. Engagement data gives you something to talk about or something to talk with and through to help get over that, inertia that's often there in difficult conversations, which we know managers struggle with. And I probably did at the beginning of my career too. So I find it's a tool for teams, it's a tool for managers, and actually, I ultimately think it helps you have the right conversation in a different way.
So let's sort of wrap up with a different approach to the same question. So I think a lot of executives tend to sort of outsource this kind of thinking to their HR function. Like it's your job to think about people as people. It's my job to think about product and margins or whatever. But that's not enough. If your relationship, there are two relationships that really matter to people at work. One is with the person next to them, or do they have a friend at the organization? Is one of the highest indicators of their willingness to stay, and their immediate manager. And if that person isn't part of the solution, they're part of the problem, arguably. Where so for those leaders that might say to themselves, I do outsource this side of things uh, to HR. Is the place to start with sort of some level of self-examination? I mean, like, all right, I haven't spent time with what people have said about me, or maybe we don't have a mechanism for that. Where do you start?
So there's different angles. You can appeal to anybody through the self-interest. We know that's the ultimate sort of way of getting people's attention. But if you're a CEO, let's say you're talking to a CEO or the MD, trust is at an all-time low, and trust is a huge thing that makes a difference, right? Just ask them, do you believe trust belongs as a metric under the HR team, or are you, as the leader of the organization, not ultimately responsible for that? And it's about, where do you want accountability? Because where accountability sits, you're either hiding, behind or from data, right? So in my sort of point of view here. But I think organizations, the leader of an organization or of a team, if they genuinely want to be in control of what's happening and actually having the best for it, you have to own the metrics that matter, I believe. You don't outsource the profit and the bottom line to somebody else. Why would you do that to the fundamental um, thing around people? If you, of course, believe that it makes a difference. So if you don't believe it makes a difference, then that second conversation is to talk to those people to actually understand why not and where they believe the difference comes from. Because sustainably over time, it is through people. And it's going to be increasingly through people and their relationship with technology, rather than replacing everybody, with AI. But I think it is about, it's a metric, and it's, you know, who owns it at the end of the day, who can be made accountable for it, and the buck stops with you as a leader. So you need to choose which of the things, you're going to own personally. But
Hmm.
every leader can get better when you use data. And I've never met a leader who didn't actually want to improve. We don't normally have the tools to it. This is one of the key tools to make you a better leader.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a perfect place to end the official part of the podcast. But something we like to do every time is to ask people, what's making you happy?
As we speak, I'm between roles, and I've had a mix of time to use with my aging parents have dementia in the family, and I've had time to do that. I'm not happy about that, but I'm happy I've had the moments to spend time to do some of those, and with my kids too. So I still have two boys who are still teenagers, and I love traveling, and I'm really at the moment enjoying having well, don't even have to try to share my enthusiasm for travel and experiencing the world. And we're not long back from a couple of weeks traveling around Vietnam and seeing some of the stuff that I like. We all like exploring food and seeing things from different points of view. So I'm just happy that there's stuff we share while that time together is precious, and then I can share stories of that with my own family too.
Well, that's great. Well, and the great thing about being a traveler is no matter where your kids get to in life, if you're big travelers, you can come together to do it together.
Yes,
Uh,
yeah.
uh,
Long may that adventure continue.
Long may that adventure continue. All right, last question. What is on your horizon? What are you working on and thinking about next?
Yeah, so I'm never a dull day. So whilst I am sort of, as I said, between executive roles, I'm hoping to change that soon. But I've really used the time as well to pursue something else I write and enjoy, which is writing. And I was an accidental author. I never planned on writing books, but it's a way of perusing a topic and engaging experts to get behind stuff. And this time, my book, which will be coming out shortly, has been looking at decision making and actually bringing the human and the AI together. It's currently called Decisions That Carry, when judgment and data create clarity and trust. And it touches on some of the things we've touched on today. Because I do think there's a moment where, the way we do stuff, we need to keep the human element not only, out there and available, but how do we do it in a structured and scalable way before we no longer have that chance? So it's a great learning, and it brings me into contact with lots of minds doing things similarly. And yeah, so I'm writing, I'm authoring again. Who thought?
Oh, that sounds like a brilliant project. I mean, one of the most interesting use cases for AI, at least I found it, is as a not a decision maker, but a partner in making decisions. You know, using it as a if you can get it to be critical, which can be a challenge, but a critical interrogator of your assumptions and a thought partner. I hate that phrase, but done right, it really can be.
Soundboarding. So I obviously, because I'm writing, I have to be very painfully clear that I'm not letting AI write anything, because then it really just distorts it. So I've been learning AI under those tight conditions, but I've been finding it very useful to bounce things off and between different AIs. So not just the Chat GPT, but I've got Perplexity, I've got Claude, and that way I'm sort of triangulating, keeping it neutral. But for me, it's about protecting the thinking. And I was just writing this morning that if I haven't sat long enough with the idea myself, and I haven't even written something down once and tested it, I shouldn't be using AI yet. It's
Yes,
thereafter.
yeah, right. You it what's the analogy? Like it's important to read the book before you see the movie. Um
Yes.
that it's very I don't care how experienced you are, how many years you've got thinking about things. Once if you just sort of toss something to the AI and say, what's important about freedom at work? And it starts spitting out, five important things with, silly metaphorical names. It's very hard to then pull back and generate your own critical thought and creativity.
Yeah, and the quandary which we have at the moment is critical thinking is one of those skills you really need to develop more alongside AI, and yet the more you would use AI, if you don't do it in the right way, you will kill your critical thinking skills. So it's I'm sort of testing out what are the behavioral sort of guardrails for myself, such that I grow it rather than destroy it whilst leaning into AI.
Well, I'm sure that when you're done, it will be time to come back on the Happiness Index podcast. Fiona, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Bye, everyone.